Hi there. As Greg said, my name is Josh. I do a lot more of the IT and web-based applications here at Ativo, and today I'm going to be focused mainly on the SQL database administrator functions, usually performed with database backups and system maintenance in SQL. As you can see by our agenda, this is where we're going to get started. So, go over here. I will switch over to a server, and actually we're going to do a little bit of this live in just a moment. But I will be addressing, as I said, database backups, and I'm going to be explaining the differences between full and simple mode for the backups, because that goes directly into how the actual maintenance plan is going to be looked at. So let me switch over here to the server here. And this is an example of a backup plan. If you are very familiar with this, I know I'm speaking with a few people that are definitely familiar with keeping their databases backed up, obviously very important. But the reason this is important for the purposes of this discussion is I will be talking about what the difference is between a full backup and a simple backup and why those need to be carefully determined before doing extended maintenance plans. So first of all, the difference between a full backup and a simple backup, if I grab over this database right here and choose my properties on this database, I can see that the backup mode in options is currently set to simple. What this particular option means is that a full backup can be done of the entire database. However, transaction logs are not being kept. Transaction logs indicate all the individual transactions that occur in a database during the course of the day. This would allow you, if you kept hourly transaction log backups, if we were set to full, then we would be able to restore to any of those incremental transaction log backups at any point in time. The reason this is important to the maintenance plan is because during the course of your average day where you're not running a maintenance plan, you might have a couple thousand transactions per day. That transaction log will grow, but very slowly. During the course of a reindex or reorganize of the master index and the maintenance plan, which we'll be covering in just a moment, you might have tens of thousands of transactions being undertaken by the database per minute. During that course of that time, your transaction log will grow quite exponentially. So therefore, you have a determination to make between whether or not you want this recovery model to be set to full or simple during any maintenance plan. If you are going to perform a manual maintenance plan, I recommend that you keep the recovery model in simple for the duration of the manual maintenance plan. If you do need to perform the maintenance plan that we'll be covering here in a moment in full backup mode, because you can't get online to change it, then you will need to perform other steps to keep that transaction log regularly emptied and truncated. And we'll talk a little bit about that now. So I'm going to change this one to full. So now that I've changed that backup task to full, I can see that I'm keeping a regular backup. Now, if I want to keep a transaction log backup, I will need to create a subplan, subplan 2 in this case. And on subplan 2, I will create another backup database task for transaction logs. So whereas normally backup type would be full, I'm now going to choose a transaction log backup, so that way I can keep my transaction log regularly truncated and emptied so that the transaction log does not grow during the course of the 10,000 plus transactions that might occur during a maintenance plan. So I make that change. It puts it in, it's going to save it as a PRN file, which again might be increment every hourly, or during a maintenance plan, I actually suggest that this might occur every 5 to 10 minutes, because once again, you're going to be getting a lot of transactions for a lot of your bigger databases. Another step that's very useful is to carefully determine what is going on with the disk space on the server. And that means that you need to carefully check out the available disk space on the server. Pull that up. So let me pull that up here. Actually, remember this. I'm logged into the wrong server at the moment, but the key is always check your disk space to make sure that you have enough room for any of the backups and transaction logs that will be taken during the course of this plan. If you do run a maintenance plan in the middle of the night and you run it on a machine that doesn't have a lot of clearance for growth in your transaction log, you're going to see it grow quite exponentially, and ultimately you could actually run out of space during the middle of the night and actually find yourself in a bad situation the next morning. Now let's talk about the actual maintenance plan for the general maintenance. I have 4 jobs that I like to run during a typical maintenance plan. Those 4 jobs are the check database integrity task, the update statistics task, the rebuild index task, and the reorganize index task. So a quick definition of some of these things. The check database integrity task is going to be looking for corruption within the database before we even get started. If we do have a corrupted database, the last thing that we want to do is start rebuilding and reorganizing indexes during the course of your the maintenance plan. Therefore, if this one fails, we'll actually be able to tell that this has failed before we actually get to the rest of it. Update statistics task is very important to the rest of the jobs because what this does is it actually reports on the statistics of which tables and views in the database are used the most often and which ones are used the least often. If any of you are familiar with disk management and defragmentation, the idea is basically the same. If you have a table or a view that is used most often, you want to put that at the very front of the database, at the very front of the record. If you have things that are used very sparingly, maybe old data that hasn't been referenced or looked up in decades, we want to put that at the back of the database, something that might take a little longer for the hard drive to actually spin to and get to. There is no defragmentation of the hard drive where you have this kind of a database. We deliberately do not touch the fragmentation of a hard drive for a database. We only want to do that within the database itself, and that's what these maintenance plans do. So once you have your statistics taken as far as which tables and views are used most and least often, then we get to the rebuild index task. And that's where we actually are grabbing tables and views and carefully determining which data within that table is carefully pushed at the front of the record to make this record more searchable, more, in the other word, being indexable, so that you can do a search for an account, for example, and if you've got 30,000 accounts and an index has been created, it'll pop up in a search much faster. And then the last thing goes back to what we're talking about with the statistics, which is where we actually take the individual indexes that are used most and least often and placing them again at the front or back of the database. So if you're a company that has many accounts that you're searching between, but you might have perhaps less orders, well, in that case, they would be putting the indexes for the searching of the accounts at the front of the database and this index for the searching of the orders at the end. Once again, this all comes back to updating the statistics. If you're not updating the statistics, you're not going to get a very good rebuild of the indexes and reorganization of the indexes. I'm just about wrapping up here before we'll move on. As I mentioned earlier, it is very important to take a look at your disk space and account for growth, but it's also important that as you're truncating these logs that you also pay attention to the files that are accumulating. And so that is where the last thing that I will typically do is add a maintenance cleanup task option. And what this is for is this will allow us to go into the file folders and perform deletes of any of the backup files that are no longer necessary, any of the truncate or of the transaction log backups that are no longer necessary, and perform that to keep and retain only certain information. John Brennan is going to be speaking about data retention as far as inside of the database. Once again, this maintenance cleanup task is actually for files that are outside of the database that are performed and stored as logs or as backups as a result of these maintenance tasks. So in this case, I would be able to pick a folder, pick a file extension, and choose how many days or weeks of data I would like to retain in that folder. Obviously, if you don't have a lot of disk space in your backup folder, you want to have less, or you want to keep less backups or have more disk space whenever possible. So let me return back to my slides here for a moment. Go back here. And just review what we've covered so far. So we did cover your general database backups, which again, I'm assuming most of you are very familiar with. You obviously have large companies. You want to make sure that you're backed up in case of emergency, in case of disaster. We talked about the difference between full and simple mode, because if you are in the backup mode of full, then you will be dealing with an incremental growth of your transaction log, in which case you will need to use transaction log backups to keep that growth under managed. Simple mode would be allowing you only to keep or to take a full backup from time to time, which does not give you the flexibility of having a transaction log backup. Shrinking and truncating the transaction log is done automatically when you do a transaction log backup. This is very necessary, otherwise you're going to get too much growth. And then, of course, we've got the SQL maintenance cleanup task, which will remove all of the backups that are created during the course of this particular maintenance. Then lastly, we've got our SQL maintenance plans. We gave you some examples of some jobs that I like to run in the order in which I like to run them. There are additional jobs that you may be interested in, for example, the shrink of the database. Microsoft and many other reputable organizations do not recommend the shrink of the database unless you are dealing with an extreme circumstance. For example, if your master database has grown, or when I say master, I mean your production database has grown beyond 200% of the allotted size, then a shrink might be useful, but it's still, even in that case, not recommended because it can result in corruption of the data. And as I mentioned earlier, when you're reindexing that database, it's performing tens of thousands of transactions every couple of minutes. So you have to keep an eye on your transaction log that goes with your master data file during the course of that action. So you remember, every single database has two files. There's an MDF and an LDF. The MDF is your production database where all of your active data is stored, and your LDF is your transaction log that's indicating any transaction that's occurring against that database in case you actually do need to roll back for one reason or another. Pay very close attention to your file folders and when you actually want to schedule these jobs, because these jobs can, with all these transactions per minute, can result in some performance degradation during the course of that maintenance plan. All right, I'm through with my thing. Greg, have there been any questions that have come up?
Then we have a couple that came in on chat, I think. Let's go ahead and cover the chat questions first, and then we'll go ahead and open up the phone line for everyone. The first question that came in is, can you please explain the difference between full and simple mode again?
Okay, so once again, full and simple mode. A full backup mode, it's a bit of a misnomer in that if you have a simple mode, you can only take full backups. You cannot take a transaction log backup, which might only take you a couple minutes to take a transaction log backup. But if you are in simple mode, the system is not paying attention to individual transactions. So the reason that's useful during a reindex is because obviously you won't be restoring to a point in time in the middle of your reindex. So those hundreds of thousands of transactions that occur during the reindex are no longer necessary and they don't need to be tracked. If you do need to be in full backup, because we do recommend to all of our customers that you be in full backup so that you can restore to an individual point in time, you want to be in full backup mode so that you can restore to an incremental transaction log backup. For example, if you had a full backup last night at midnight and you have incremental hourly transaction log backups all the way up until 8 p.m. tonight, you can then restore back to 7 a.m. in the morning or whenever some problem occurred in your database. If you did not have transaction log backups, you would only be able to restore to last night at midnight.
Second question, which databases should have a maintenance plan?
I prefer to do these maintenance plans with the indexes only for your user production databases. In most companies, your master and your MSDB, a lot of the system databases do not need to be reindexed or reorganized because you're just not dealing with the amount of overhead from multiple users, multiple security credentials that are going around. Yeah. So what that might look like here is, so these are the user databases. These are the ones that should have a maintenance plan. If you have backup databases or test databases, there's really no reason to suffer your system to the stress of a maintenance plan for test databases, because if they're just a little bit slower over the course of a few months, those aren't as necessary. But production databases should absolutely have a regular maintenance plan. I recommend every week or every month, depending upon the size of those production databases.
And kind of related to that, how many backup files do you recommend a user keep?
Once again, it depends on your the amount of overhead in your production or your disk space environment. So if you've got a couple extra terabytes lying around and you feel comfortable keeping a couple of weeks of backups, well, that would be nice, because if your accounting manager wants to know what your database looked like 2 months ago, you'd be able to restore a database from months ago and have you and be looking at that data, fairly quickly. Most of us don't have that luxury. So most of us only have room for maybe 4 or 5 disk backups. So if your database is 50 gigs and you have 5 backups, you can see that's quickly using 250 gigabytes of space just for those 5 backups alone. So it really is determined by your needs and how much disk space you have available for these backups.
And then one just came in over chat. Does the translog BU require a maintenance plan cleanup as well?
Yes, it does. That's a great question, especially since they are running every hour, or as we recommend every hour, in some cases less, in some cases more. Those will start to add up over time, even though they are often between 10 and 35 megabytes in size, depending on how many transactions you have per day. They can absolutely add up over time. I usually don't recommend more than 2 days of transaction log backups, because if it's more than 2 days, you're probably going to use a full backup anyway.
And what happens if I don't have a maintenance plan?
Over time, your databases will not pay attention to, for example, these statistics. So so certain areas of your database will not improve in speed, especially as it grows. So perhaps if you have many orders, and the orders are stored in the back of the database, using a relative term, over time, as the database grows, that database is farther and farther to the back of that database. So you start to see slowness, and you start to deal with the wear and tear of having to constantly look up data that is actually in the back of the database and spinning that drive over and over again to get to some little piece of data. With a regular maintenance plan, that information can be pushed to the front, especially if the statistics say that that is used more often than other data that might be not as necessary. So for example, documents that you might upload once and then forget about for the next 3 or 4 years.
And then how or when should I review the health of my SQL maintenance plan?
How or when? This would be a good time. So just look into your SQL server, see what you have. And actually, I can see one good point about that. If you explode out the SQL Server agent area down here at the bottom, there is jobs. So it is a very good idea from time to time to open this up, right-click, and choose View History. View History is going to tell us exactly all the times this maintenance plan has been successful, but also all the times it has been unsuccessful. If we want to explode that, look at that even further, we'd be able to find out the reason that failed. So if I look down here, it actually has some kind of a problem with this maintenance plan when it ran back here at the end of January. So a good administrator would be able to look into this and correct the problem, perform a few tests, and make sure that the backup is now running at a regular time. In this case, it's running for us at 9 p.m. and it's been successful for the last 10 days.
That was all those questions that came in at chat. I am going to open up the phone lines for a few minutes here, so if there are any live questions, we can get those covered before moving on to the second portion of the webinar. Everyone's line should be open. So again, I just want to reiterate, if you don't have a question, please self-mute your phone so we don't get all the background noise. And if there are any questions, fire away. Would seem as though perhaps we've covered everything through the chat questions. All right then, if there are no additional questions on SQL maintenance, we're going to go ahead and remute everyone's phones, and we will go ahead and let John dive into his portion of the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Greg, and great job, Josh. We're going to talk now for a little bit about the concept of purging, and if any of you out there are anything like I am, it sort of sends chills down my spine as soon as I hear the word purge and a little box that I can put a check mark in. If any of you are like me, probably you have stuff from 30 years ago that you just can't get rid of because you know you're going to need it sometime. Well, that's pretty much the way a lot of folks feel about the concept of cleaning up their database. You have your daily activities for processing become slower. Why would I want to purge? Well, you're really offsetting the benefit of having the data with how your performance works as far as the solution is concerned. So one of the things we're talking about is the processing becomes slower. Some of you may have already experienced it. You also may get to the point where your files are so big you can't print a crystal report. I mean, there are a number of things that can go wrong. Several of them including processes such as MRP, crystal report generation, creating views. All of that stuff slows down, which irritates not only you but also irritates the users of in your organization. And some processes just stop working altogether because we have too much data and because we can't get rid of it because we never know when we're going to need it. The other thing that it might be is older data can contain corrupt data that sometimes hinders processing. If you run your file validation, you're going to see there's some things that are broken, but it's from back in 1994. Probably we can get rid of that stuff, and maybe that will even improve our processes. Sometimes it even stops the process from working. Also, by keeping significant amounts of data, additional space could be required to store it all. Let's be clear, Josh was very good about the maintenance plan and doing backups and getting rid of it. That's exterior. Interior stuff inside of Macola. You may require additional space, additional hard drive space for all the things that you're saving. So that's why we might want to get rid of it. The next thing we might want to talk about just a little bit here is the fact that we want to talk about the how do we fix it. Well, we can fix it by purging the old data. We want to purge the old data using the Macola interface. And what that does is, if you've been into a report, and I use the bill of material audit file. Go into the bill of material audit file, and when I print the report out, there's a little box down at the bottom that says purge. You can click on that, and once you're done, it'll actually purge the file for you. But you're able to send it to the report to a printer or a disk. If you're not purging the file, you can send it to the screen, and that's good, and you can see what's in there. Get a good look. But if I need to get rid of the information, I'm able to do it using that purge button. I'm able to select the dates that I want to get rid of, that I want to purge, and it will require that you print the information out. You don't get to, it's like when you're creating a purchase order, you have to print the purchase order, period. And it has to go to a printer. We also want to use the file initialization and progression. That as well is a way of handling getting rid of the data. But when you initialize a file in progression, you don't get a chance to select what data you want to get rid of. It cleans up that entire file. We can also use SQL queries to selectively delete records from the file. So if we want to do that, we want to go into SQL. We can actually delete all the items from the file, or we can selectively delete them by date. One of the things we want to be careful of is that anytime we do a delete using SQL query, we need to be really careful about what it is that we're deleting. The other thing is that it's probably one of those things that you're going to want somebody that's very good at using SQL queries and update and delete functions. You want somebody who is very comfortable doing that, because the last thing you want to do is delete current information that you will never get back. One thing I want to point out, if we're using either initialize in progression or SQL queries, once it's gone, it's gone. You don't get a chance to print out a report. You really need to be very careful. The final piece we want to talk about is using the Pulse archive utility. So when we talk about using the archive utility, really what we're talking about is, well, okay, so here's the deal. Maybe I don't need to keep this in my closet downstairs, but what if I package it up and put it into the attic, because you never know when you're going to need it again. So what we're saying here is, rather than deleting it, rather than purging it, we're going to say we're going to take it out of the active database, and we're going to move that and put it into an archive database. We're also able to report and print reports on the archive utility, on the archive database, but the fact is it's no longer interfering with how we run our business. All right, so here's what we're going to, the next thing we want to talk about is how we're going to purge the information using Macola. And I had mentioned that we can do it on various number of screens, and you'll see where those screens are. First of all, data can be purged from various reporting screens, and you'll know where they are because once you get in there, down at the bottom, you see the little purge file that we've highlighted, not only in progression, but as well in Macola, ES and EM10. It really is the best practice to password protect the purge functionality as it is final. When you do this, it's done. You want to be very careful. And also, the report has to be printed to paper or file. That's sort of protecting you from yourself. If you print it to a paper, bring out the green bar, you're going to be there for a while. And that's really what takes the most amount of time is the printing functionality. The other piece is if I'm going to print it to a file, when you print that file, you've spooled the report. When you print that file, you have the option to delete it. And if you delete that spooled report again, you're out of luck because the data is gone. In this instance, it does require that you print the information out for the purge, and it does require that you actually do print it out, either hard copy or to a file, and forces you to make the decision as to whether you want to save it. Now, if you don't want to save a printed report, you just take it out and have the trash man pick it up. If you're printing it to a file, you do have the option every time you print that report out to delete the report. Again, this is one of those things that scares me just a little bit. I don't want to get rid of something that I may need in the future. I could be a little bit overreactive here, but for the most part, yeah, I really want to save this stuff someplace. So what we're going to talk about now is we want to fix the problem. What's the problem? Well, we did talk about the problem being slowing down your system, corrupt data, etc. So let's take a look at the 3 different ways that we have as far as getting rid of the data is concerned outside of the archive process. The first one we talk about is we want to talk about the table list, and the table list shows up in ES. And we have the delete file. Again, there's going to be some caution here. We'll show you progression and system manager initialize caution, and finally we have the SQL delete contents of the table. Again, we want to be very careful whenever we do any of this. So let's take a look at the first item, the deleting files in ES and EM10. What we're seeing here is if we go to the table index under System Manager, what we're seeing here is these are all the tables, the index, the fields, and the records that we have. In this particular instance, we're looking at the ES table list, and I selected the BMPRD AUD file, the audit file for the bill of materials product structure. What we'll notice over here on the right-hand side, that we have a number of records. There are 76 records in there. Well, if we want to get rid of all those records and not have any recourse to the information that we had there, we can simply hit the delete all file. We're going to get rid of all of these. Now, again, when we're deleting them all from the table list, we don't get a backup, we don't get a report, we don't even get to send it to a file. It's gone. Again, when you do this, it's gone forever. Let's talk just a little bit about initializing the information in Macola. So when we initialize the information in Macola, again, we're going down to the process under System Manager, selecting whether we want to initialize accounting or distribution or manufacturing, so we select that. We then select the item that we want in this particular instance, inventory. We selected the product structure audit file, which is the BMPRD AUD audit file. We're going to put a check mark in there, and we're going to hit save. It's going to let you know that you're going to be getting rid of this. And the other thing I want you to be careful of, again, when you initialize the file, we want you to be careful. Once it's gone, just as this is the table list we were talking about a moment ago, when it's gone, it's empty, it's not there anymore. The other thing you really want to be careful of, and I would suggest that you never do this, is initialize all of your bill of material files. If you do, if you initialize all of any of the files structure that we're looking at, it takes you back to 1996. There's nothing there. You get an opportunity to start all over again. That's not often what we want to do, so my thought would be don't ever use that. And finally, let's take a look at the SQL approach to how we're going to get rid of the records. So using SQL to fix the problem, we want to be able to go in and find that file. Notice here there's 76 records, just as there were when we looked at the table list. We can actually create a SQL script that will delete all of the files here. Now, one of the things that we're able to do here, as opposed to the initialization that we did with progression, is we can actually create a SQL script that will not only delete the records, but can delete them by date. So I can select another criteria, and I don't need to delete everything in the file. I can delete them individually, one by one. Or I can create a SQL query or SQL script that is going to delete certain records based upon a criteria that I've established. I still have to point out again that we don't get it. You know, there's no hard copy. There's no report to the file. It's simply gone. All right, so now that we've discussed those two solutions, let's talk about the downside, and I think we probably just covered most of those. First of all, understand the data is lost forever. When you purge it, unless you can find it in one of the reports that we've generated, and you haven't gotten rid of the report, and you haven't got rid of the hard copy or the file, you can't find it unless you go through and search. And quite frankly, I wouldn't want to hire somebody to go in and find that data. Secondly, it takes a long time, and probably this may be the reason. If you've ever purged a file or purged a number of different files, you realize that it takes a long time. Now, the purge is not the problem. The purge is I need to go. The problem winds up being I need to print all that information out. And maybe when I went in and purged 76 records for the bill of material audit file, it took 51 pages to print, and I printed them to a file. And that was only for 76 items. Everything was current. For anything that's longer than that, understand that it's going to take you progressively longer in order to run this. Which means if it takes me that long to run it, I'm actually going to need to do this probably overnight or on the weekend. So with those three things taken into consideration, purging rarely gets done. We don't often do it. Only because, well, first of all, you're going to lose the data. It takes a long time. You've got to do it overnight, and if you're like me, I know I'm going to need it sometime. Now, with that being said, we have another option, and that other option happens to be the concept of retention or archiving versus purging. So why would we want to approach this strategy? Why would we think that this is the best way to go? Well, if we look at our current database is our house, excuse me, and the archive is like the attic. I'm sure most people have an attic, or maybe they have some that are going to put in a garage, or going to put it in a basement and some shelves. So because you really don't want to get rid of it, I do want to save it, but wow, I don't want to save it in my database. So we want to be able to identify desired retention periods for each type of data. All of the data that you have is not the same. You may have tax records that need to be maintained for 7 or 10 years. You may have production records that need to be saved. Company records that need to be saved, sales records that need to be saved. But they don't all need to be saved for the same amount of time. You need to establish a record retention program that helps you save exactly what it is that you need. Next thing you need to do is you need to create an archive company. We're not just sticking it in a basket. We're actually creating an archive company that allows us, using the Pulse archive utility, actually allows us to go in and create the archive company and then take the information out of the live company and put it into the archive company. Well, what that's going to do? Well, that's really going to speed up your processing, because the same way a purge would get rid of the information but lose it, the archive utility allows you to get rid of the information in your live company but save it. It's going to reduce production based to only the desired retention period data. And I have to tell you that probably you're not going to have the same retention requirements for every table, every file that you're going to be sending to the archive. You need to go through and take the time to figure out what it is that I need as far as retention is concerned. Next thing, we may want to repeat the process periodically. Now, what does that mean? Well, periodically is one of those comments and conversations that you have. How often do I want to do a backup? Well, periodically. Well, that means could be daily, could be weekly, could be monthly, could be semi-annually, could be annually, and it could be when the cows come home. The fact is that you need to understand what it is that you want to do and when you want to do it. So I have the ability to run an archive utility that could actually back up all of my information on a monthly basis for some of it, but maybe on an annual basis for the rest of it. And the next thing is we're removing the data from the live company and putting it into the archive company. And the great thing about an archive utility is that it actually allows us to go in and query the information that's in the archive. You don't lose it, and it's very simple to access. So let's take a look at, now that we've talked about that, let's talk just a little bit about the data retention policy that you might be putting into effect. There are a number of different decision points for both progression and Macola that we need to understand, and we need to define the procedures and the files that are purged. We need to decide how much we want to keep. Do we want to keep 11 months, 12 months, 6 months, 36 months? How much do we want to keep? So the whole idea here is you need to find out you need to define what it is that you want to save and how long you want to retain that. Let's take a little bit of a look at the product that we're talking about here, and that's the Pulse Archive Utility. And the Pulse Archive Utility actually takes the pain out of any archiving and maintaining a sound records retention policy. And again, much like a physical inventory, a cycle count, anything that we're doing that we're expecting to get good results out, we need to create a foundation that gives us the information we want. You need to analyze what it is, the records that you need to keep, and you need to establish a policy, because the system is only as smart as you are. It's only as smart as the information you put in. What this does is the archive utility actually utilizes the archive database that we mentioned a little bit earlier, and that's managed with a one-click process. So rather than having to go to all the individual files, all the individual tables, all the individual SQL tables, by selecting the information that we want to archive on an appropriate basis, one-click possibility allows us to archive that database into the archive database. It also allows for a structured archiving and reindexing plan to keep data up to date. And again, if we've had some trouble as far as the performance is concerned and it's running slower than it used to, and maybe we need to go and take a look at how we're doing our purging, if we are, and how we want to save the data in the records retention plan that we want to be able to use. So let's go take a look, and the next thing we want to take a look at is going to be creating the archive database, and this is part of the utility itself. If we could scooch down to one more slide. There we go. Creating the archive database. We want to select the database to be archived, and this is part of the utility. We want to select the database to be archived in the database where the archive data is to be inserted. We're now establishing by server, by the database, and where we want to put it. How do we want this to work? Where do we want to take it from, and where do we want to put it to? The next thing we have is going to have the data analysis tool. And what I'm going to do right now, and I'm going to ask Terry Moore if he'll jump in and give a little bit of information about the data analysis tool, because what this allows us to do is take a look at the information and determine how we want to create the archive utility, how we want to determine what our records retention plan is. Terry?
Yes, thanks, John. Can everybody hear me? I think so.
Gotcha.
The Pulse archive utility does have a couple of reporting options, and one of these is how many records do I have in each of these tables by year? And they've provided a data analysis tool, and I'll go ahead and mention the other report. It's called a reindexing report, so it shows you the fragmentation by table. But we'll talk about the data analysis tool today. I realize the screen might be a little hard to see, but when you look at the section, the title Category 1, it shows you the transaction tables that you use on a day-to-day basis. And then Category 2, so this will be your very important tables. Category 2 was mostly your audit tables. And so what you can see out here in this example is we're displaying 4 years worth of data, 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. It'll also automatically, when you say I want to see 4 years worth, and you'll notice we're only partway through 2016, but it considers that as a whole year when you specify how many years you want to display. So in this example, it'll show us, it'll automatically put in a column that shows you after 2016 and prior to 2013. What we've done in this example is we've highlighted by color, the one in yellow, the ones that could be archived without too much thought at all, because we do have this archive company, as John mentioned, that we could always go back to and do reports against. And so I'm going to go to the one highlighted in green here, which happens to be the order line history table. And in this example, we're saying that we want to keep 2013, 14, 15, and 16, but anything prior to 2013, we want to delete. And so we want to set up for this retention period in the screen that follows as to how many months we want to retain. And in this case, 4 times 12, we'd want to maintain 48 months worth and then get rid of anything prior to 2013. And then down below, all the audit tables, if we wanted to, we could purge all the data in those tables as well. There's another thing I want to point out in this data analysis tool that's available to you through this product, is there's a blank and null field. And what this has to do with is if there's any records that are blank or null, it'll display those in this field. And in this example, from top to bottom, there weren't any, which is a good thing. But if there were some, then we would want to further investigate the data to see what's going on there. I think that's it, John, on this particular screen.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Terry. Let's talk about setting the records, setting the retention policy that we have. We've just gone through and analyzed for what Terry has walked us through. We now know by each of the individual areas pretty much how we want to set up our records retention piece. So what this screen actually shows is that the data can be archived and the files affected based on date. So you'll notice where we have, and again, it's hard to see Macola files to be affected. You'll notice that there's the file, but there's also a doc_date, etc. When we define how many months of activity we want to keep, okay, we're going to say we want 36 months based upon a specific date. And that date example, for instance, is the AR commissions due file. We want to make sure that when we select that 36 months, we want to make sure that it uses a doc date, for instance, as opposed to the OR date, etc. So we actually get to decide when we want this to happen. Oh, by the way, take a look at the include in report. What we're saying here is I don't need to archive everything all of the time. And again, if we were talking a little bit further to the right, which I didn't include in the slide, is how we want to and when we want to do the archive. If we want to do it only in January, maybe we want to do it in June, maybe we want to do it in July. We're able to decide when we want this particular archive utility to run. And we want to make sure that we're saving, as Terry showed you. Right now we're showing 36 months here. What we showed you before, what we showed you earlier was all of the information for 4 years. So we showed you 2016, 15, 14, 13, and everything before 13. And if we find that we only need 3 years worth of information, we can actually go in and change a month of active data. We can change that here. All right, let's take a look at the next slide. And what the next slide actually walks us through is we want to also talk a little bit about the data that's affected. So for instance, if we were looking at the OE header history file, there's 3 different tables that we would need to take a look at: the history file, the line history file, and the comment history file. And all of those have separate dates. And based upon our selection, when we want to archive the OE order history file, it's going to archive the information based upon these dates. So this is a pull down utility, and it shows the tables that are going to be affected and the dates used for each table in the archiving process. Next thing we want to do is walk through just a little bit. Now, we spoke a little bit earlier, and I think Terry mentioned the fact this is just a one-button deal. So when we look at this, we have the ability at the top of the screen to select Start Archiving Process. And we really want to be kind of careful because the archiving process, again, we're doing the purge. We're not losing the data forever, but we're putting it someplace where you're not going to have it available to you in the current database. So before you start the process, let's be clear, you want to have a good backup. You always want to have a good backup, and that's not just about the archiving utility. That's about any time you want to be doing something with your database. Next, you want to review the settings for the process. And finally, you need to have all users out of the system. That's why it's best to do it at night or over the weekend, etc. Everybody needs to be out. And again, let's recognize the fact that this is going to take a while. So let's take a look at the other portion of that, and that's going to be the reindexing piece. So now that we've archived all of that, now that we've got everything put where it needs to be, now we need to go through the reindexing process. And this is similar to the reindexing process that Josh was talking about a little bit earlier. We want to make sure that now that we've cleaned it all up, now we need to reindex it and actually gain as much of the efficiency as we possibly can. And we do that by running the reindexing process. Again, this is going to take a while. All right, we'll also notice over on the right-hand side, we see where there's an audit trail. We have that. And also, we see a little icon here for the reports themselves. These are the reports that Terry was mentioning. And there are a number of reports that are available to us as far as this is concerned. So what I'd like to do right now, I think, and I went over some of this stuff pretty quickly. Len and Terry, if you have anything you want to add, that would be perfect. I'd appreciate that.
No, I think
we good?
You did a great job, John, and I think we can go right to questions.
Perfect. We have a couple questions that came in over chat, John, so let me go ahead and cover those first, and then again, we'll go ahead and unmute everyone's phone lines. The first question is, you mentioned file initialize. When should you use this?
Okay, here, my thought on that is I probably don't like to initialize a file, and the reason is because based upon the information that's in there, it's all gone. If you don't mind losing everything that's in there and you want to start from scratch, that's fine. You can initialize an audit file, for instance. You can initialize work files. Those are probably the ones that are not going to be too much of a problem. I don't really want anything in my work files, and if I'm good with my audit files, I can get rid of those as well. But I have a tendency to not like to do that.
If you recall, John, that initialize function goes back to the B-tree days where data was easily corrupted, and we needed to export data, initialize the file, re-import it so it all got indexed again, and so forth. It really is not designed to be used with progression SQL, and certainly it's not available in Macola ES or EM10 because now we have SQL utilities that replace that function of initialize. So.
And
excellent,
thank you,
very
Ryan.
good.
And John, are there any tables that typically get very large?
Oh, one of the files that does get pretty big is your item in transaction history file. A lot of people like to save all that because they know for a fact, well, I'm going to need to figure out if I have a problem, I need to go all the way back to the beginning of time to figure out why I have an inventory problem. That's one of the tables that actually does get pretty large. Also makes it tough to do some processing. And Len and Terry, you've worked with this a lot, probably a lot more than I have. The tables that I think are probably pretty important, again, though, we have some files in MRP that probably need to be processed. Terry, Len?
Yeah.
Any specific tables?
Go ahead, Terry.
The audit
I was going to
tables.
mention the audit tables and the MCA transactions, depending on what you're doing with manufacturing. You've got direct experience with that, Terry.
Yep.
Well, yes, and I was going to also mention the audit tables. If you have turned on the auditing, which keeps track of any update or change or delete that's made to a record in the system, those can get very large as well.
And they get large quickly too. One of the things I've found is that Normally the audit tables probably are going to be there a lot longer than you want them to be there because you think you need to see them. If you really think about it, that's one you might want to run the archive utility on a monthly basis. Once I've reviewed the audit files, I don't need to review them again as long as I've cleared up all the issues that have occurred for that month. However, I still may want to be able to see those, and that's why I'm going to want to be able to archive them.
And then one more other question that came in over chat. This company, they're planning on upgrading from progression to EM10. Would this be a good time to purge their data?
Oh, I can take that.
Terry. Okay, Len.
This is the best time, and the reason for it is important to know. With progression, if you remember the slide, there's like 40 different tables that can be purged and archived. It's all of the financial tables that are different in progression than in ES or EM10. That's why there's only about 28 or so. So the results from purging progression are far more dramatic, meaning you will have a far more lean and mean production company for carrying forward into EM10 if you purge while you're still running on progression. Now, remember, if you do purge while you're in progression, you have a progression archive company, and then you will then be on EM10. So, but there's nothing stopping you from going back to the archive company and also upgrading that to EM10 at a later time. So this would be the perfect opportunity as you make that transition from progression to EM10.
Let me add just one thing real quick. Yeah, let me just add one thing, and for the person that's going from progression to EM10, this will be your last best chance to get it right. If you don't do it now, trying to do it someplace else it just causes you a tremendous amount of pain and anguish. So going from progression to EM10, this is the best time to do it.
That's our chat question. I'm going to go ahead and open up the phone lines. We still have Josh here as well, so if anyone thought of any questions with regards to the SQL maintenance plan, Josh is also available. At this point, again, if you don't have any direct questions, I just ask that you self-mute your phone, and anyone who does have questions, go ahead and don't be shy. Oh, it sounds as though we got everything covered. Len, do you want to take us to the...
Sure, great. So I'd like to thank everyone for being with us today. I just wanted to let you know that we do have 2 more webinars coming up, one next Thursday and then the following Thursday. Next Thursday is an overview of WISE's Agility. This is a tool that if you don't already have it, you'll really want it after you see the way this works and how it takes either your progression or your ES or EM10 system and puts it on steroids for you, and not for a lot of money. So it's something really you don't want to miss WISE's Agility. In fact, we'll have Ann Hayner from WISE's on.
Yes, correct.
Right? And then the following Thursday, we're going to take the mystery out of MRP and basically get down to the fundamentals so you can make a determination, hey, when should I be using MRP? Should I be using it now? What should I be using it for? How do I even get started using it so that you can help make that decision and guide your organization in the right direction? So those are our upcoming webinars. And again, thank you for attending. I know your time is important. We really would love your input on any topics for future webinars. Just let us know. There's our contact information down below. Give us a call, drop us an email. And this takes time away from our day as well. We'd like to continue providing these kinds of learning sessions so you can help us by referring somebody to us, someone that doesn't have Macola yet and who needs this stuff. So that's the way that you can help us and help us afford to continue this. So thank you all again, Any other questions that come up, you can also send them to our email address as well.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.